March 6, 1945, 3:47 p.m., Cologne Cathedral Square, Germany. The gunner's periscope shattered into a spiderweb of cracks as Feldwebel Karl Hoffmann pressed his eye against it, straining to identify the unfamiliar silhouette emerging from the rubble-strewn street. For 3 years he had memorized every American tank profile: the high-riding Sherman with its 75mm pop gun, the Stuart light tanks that Tiger crews called toy panzers, even the rare jumbo Shermans with their extra armour that still couldn't penetrate a Tiger's frontal plate beyond 500 metres. But this was something else entirely. "Das ist kein Sherman," he whispered into the intercom, his voice carrying a tremor that his crew had never heard before. "That's not a Sherman." Through the cracked optics, he could see the massive gun barrel, longer, thicker than any American tank gun he'd encountered. The hull sat lower, more angular, with sloped armour that looked cast rather than welded. The turret was enormous, almost disproportionate to the hull, like someone had mounted a heavy anti-aircraft gun on a tank chassis. His mind raced through recognition charts, training silhouettes, intelligence briefings. Nothing matched. In exactly 18 seconds, Karl Hoffmann and his crew would become among the first German tank crews in history to discover that the Americans had finally built something that could kill them at any range, from any angle. The Panther tank, commanded by Wilhelm Bartelborth of Panzer Brigade 106, had already learned this lesson 3 minutes earlier. Its 5-man crew never got to report what killed them. The M26 Pershing's 90mm M3 gun spoke first. The armour-piercing round travelled at 853 metres per second, crossing the 120 metres between the two tanks in less time than it took Hoffmann to blink. The projectile struck the Panther's frontal armour at the turret face. The 100mm armour plate, which had deflected dozens of Sherman rounds in France and Belgium, split under the impact. The 90mm shell, still carrying tremendous kinetic energy, continued through the crew compartment before detonating. The mathematics of Allied victory were being written not in battle plans, but in production statistics and battlefield encounters that would shatter every assumption these soldiers carried about their enemies, their homeland, and their cause. The story of German tank superiority had been written in steel and blood since the Tigerwine first rumbled into combat at Leningrad in August 1942. For 2.5 years, German heavy tank crews had lived inside machines that seemed to violate the fundamental rules of armoured warfare. Their 88mm guns could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 metres. Their armour, 100mm thick on the front hull and 120mm on the turret, made them virtually immune to standard Allied tank guns at normal combat ranges. The psychological effect was as powerful as the mechanical advantage. Veterans of Schwer Panzerabteilung 506 described the feeling of invincibility that came with operating Tigers. The mathematics were indeed compelling. The American M4. Sherman's 75mm M3 gun could only penetrate the Tiger's frontal armour at ranges under 100 metres, and only then with special ammunition and perfect angles. The Tiger's 88mm KWK-36 could punch through a Sherman's frontal armour at 2,000 metres. By December 1944, German tank crews had developed standard tactics that exploited this technological superiority. They would position their Tigers and King Tigers at maximum range, using their superior optics and guns to destroy Allied tanks before they could close to threatening distances. A single Tiger could, and often did, hold up entire Allied advances. The most famous example occurred at Villers-Bocage in June 1944, when SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann's single Tiger destroyed 14 tanks, 2 anti-tank guns, and 13 other vehicles in less than 15 minutes, though Wittmann himself would die in August 1944, months before the Pershing arrived. This superiority created a profound psychological advantage that extended beyond the battlefield. Allied tank crews developed Tiger fever, often mistaking any German tank for a Tiger and reporting far more Tiger encounters than actually occurred. Meanwhile, German heavy tank crews developed an almost mystical belief in their invulnerability, painting kill rings on their gun barrels like fighter aces. But unknown to these confident crews, 8,000 kilometers away in the Detroit tank arsenal, American engineers had been working since September 1942 on a project designated T-26. They were building something that would shatter the myth of German tank invulnerability. The journey to the M26 Pershing began with a bitter realization. American tank design had fallen dangerously behind. The M4 Sherman, which formed the backbone of American armored forces, had been designed in 1941, when the most dangerous German tank was the Panzer IV with its short 75mm gun. By the time Shermans faced Tigers in Italy and Normandy, they were outclassed in every category that mattered: armour, firepower and effective range. The Pershing development program represented a crash effort involving 14 major contractors, 300 subcontractors, and over 50,000 workers across 22 states. Fisher Body Division of General Motors, which had been producing Sherman tanks at its Grand Blanc arsenal in Michigan, received orders to immediately retool for the new heavy tank. The changes were staggering: new casting techniques for the turret, entirely different transmission systems, and most critically the integration of the 90mm gun that had previously been used only in tank destroyers and anti-aircraft roles. The 90mm M3 gun was a marvel of American engineering. Developed from the successful 90mm anti-aircraft gun, it fired a 24-pound armour-piercing round at velocities exceeding 2,800 feet per second. The standard M82 APC round could penetrate 119mm of armour at 500 yards, enough to punch through a Tiger's frontal armour at combat ranges. The newer T-30E16 HVAP round, with its tungsten-carbide core, could penetrate 221mm at the same range, enough to threaten even the mighty King Tiger. The development was shrouded in unprecedented secrecy. Workers at the Fisher Tank Arsenal were told they were building an improved Sherman variant. Components were manufactured in separate facilities to prevent anyone from understanding the complete design. When the first 20 Pershings were sent to Europe in January 1945, they were listed as heavy maintenance equipment and covered with tarps. January 15, 1945. New York, port of embarkation. Under cover of darkness and heavy security, the first 20 M26 Pershings were loaded onto ships bound for Europe. Each tank was wrapped in waterproof covering and labelled with false shipping codes. The crews selected to operate them had been training in isolation at Fort Knox since November, sworn to secrecy under penalty of court-martial. The crossing took 11 days through U-boat-infested waters. The Pershings were positioned in the ship's holds behind rows of regular Shermans, hidden even from most of the ship's crews. The tank crews spent the voyage studying German armour recognition charts and practicing their cover story. They were replacement crews for standard Sherman units. The Pershings arrived at Antwerp on January 26, 1945, again under cover of darkness. They were immediately transported by special trains to the 3rd Armoured Division's maintenance area near Düren, Germany. Here, the crews conducted final preparations, while Division Commander Major General Maurice Rose personally briefed battalion commanders on the new weapon. February 25, 1945. The first 4 Pershings were assigned to the 3rd Armoured Division's push toward the Rhine. They were distributed 1 per task force, hidden among regular Sherman companies with strict orders to avoid combat unless engaging German heavy tanks. The crews painted them with standard olive drab and added unit markings to make them blend in, though their longer guns and lower profiles made them distinctive to trained eyes. The German intelligence failure was complete. Despite having one of the most effective intelligence services of the war, the Wehrmacht had no idea the Pershings existed. German commanders believed Americans had chosen quantity over quality as a permanent doctrine, unable to conceive that American industry could pivot to producing heavy tanks while maintaining Sherman production. February 26, 1945, near Elsdorf, Germany, marked the first Pershing combat loss. The T-26E3, nicknamed Fireball, was knocked out by a Tiger I in a close-range ambush. The Tiger's 88mm round struck the Pershing's gun mantlet, killing the gunner and loader. However, the Pershing was repaired and returned to service on March 7th, a testament to American recovery and maintenance capabilities. Over the next week, scattered reports began reaching German headquarters about encounters with an unidentified American tank with a longer gun and heavier armor than the Sherman. A Panther crew reported being destroyed at 1,800 meters by a single shot from an American vehicle they couldn't identify. Most disturbingly, every report mentioned the same detail: a gun that appeared significantly longer and larger than the standard Sherman's 75mm. March 6, 1945. The battle at Cologne Cathedral would become the most documented tank duel of World War II, captured on film by Signal Corps cameraman Jim Bates. The day began with German forces positioning remaining tanks around the cathedral square. Wilhelm Bartelborth, commanding a Panther from Panzer Brigade 106, felt confident despite the American approach. The square's open space gave clear fields of fire, and their positions behind rubble provided partial hull cover. At 15:20 hours, Bartelborth spotted movement near the destroyed Geryon Hotel. Through his periscope, he saw what he initially reported as an unusual Sherman variant with an extended gun. He ordered his gunner to engage at 300 meters, point-blank range for a Panther's high-velocity 75mm gun. The Panther fired first, its round striking the approaching tank's frontal armor. But instead of penetrating, the shot ricocheted upward in a shower of sparks. Bartelborth had exactly 3 seconds to process this impossibility before the return shot arrived. Staff Sergeant Robert Early, commanding the Pershing nicknamed Eagle 7, had already acquired the Panther in his gun sight. His gunner, Corporal Clarence Smoyer, centered the crosshairs on the Panther's mantlet and fired. The 90mm round punched through the Panther's turret face. The tank burst into flames as ammunition cooked off. The film footage captured by Jim Bates shows what happened next. Another German tank nearby, accounts vary whether it was a Tiger or another Panther, attempted to engage but was also destroyed by the Pershing with a single frontal shot. The engagement lasted less than 5 minutes, but demonstrated conclusively that American tanks could now match German armor in firepower. The destruction of German tanks at Cologne Cathedral triggered an intelligence crisis within the Wehrmacht. Oberkommando West issued urgent directives demanding all units report immediately any encounters with new American heavy tanks and provide detailed descriptions and capabilities. The responses painted a picture of technological surprise that German commanders struggled to accept. Multiple crews reported American tanks with 90mm class guns and heavy frontal armor destroying Panthers and Tigers at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters. German crews began referring to it as the long gun Sherman, unable to conceive of an entirely new American heavy tank. This misunderstanding would persist for weeks, contributing to tactical errors, as German crews attempted to engage Pershings using anti-Sherman tactics. The Panzerwaffe's training infrastructure struggled to respond. Tank schools had no information about the new American vehicle, recognition charts didn't exist, and tactical manuals assumed American tank guns couldn't penetrate German heavy armor frontally. By mid-March 1945, roughly 20 Pershings were operational in the European theatre, with more arriving weekly. While this number seems insignificant compared to the thousands of Shermans in service, the psychological impact far exceeded the mathematical ratio. German tank crews, accustomed to engaging Shermans with impunity, now approached every engagement with uncertainty. The kill ratios tell part of the story. In the limited engagements where Pershings faced German armour, they achieved positive results, though the sample size of only 20 tanks in combat makes statistical analysis problematic. What mattered more was the uncertainty. German crews couldn't distinguish Pershings from Shermans at distance, creating hesitation in every engagement. Production mathematics were even more significant. While Germany struggled to produce 100 tanks per month by early 1945, American factories had produced 2,202 M26 tanks by war's end, with Fisher-Body's Grand Blanc arsenal alone completing 1,739 units. German crews who learned about these production rates through interrogations or captured documents realized they weren't just facing a technically capable opponent. They were facing one that could replace losses at rates Germany couldn't match even at its peak. The capture of damaged Pershing components and examination of knocked-out vehicles provided German engineers and tank crews with their first close look at American heavy tank engineering. What they discovered challenged every assumption about American tank design. The cast turret was a single piece, requiring manufacturing capabilities Germany had never developed for such large components. The Ford GAF V8 engine produced 500 horsepower, while maintaining reliability German engines couldn't achieve. The transmission included advanced features that seemed impossibly complex, yet functioned smoothly. German technical officers reported that this wasn't simply an upgunned Sherman as initially assumed. Every component represented advanced engineering. The gun stabilization system allowed accurate fire while moving, something German Tigers couldn't do. The power traverse could rotate the turret 360 degrees in 15 seconds. The optics equaled German quality. The examination revealed details that particularly affected German crews' morale. The interior was spacious compared to German tanks, with better crew ergonomics. The ammunition storage included wet stowage systems to prevent fires, a feature German tanks desperately needed but lacked. Even small details like padded surfaces and interior lighting showed attention to crew comfort that German designs had sacrificed. The knowledge of American heavy tank capability spread through the Panzerwaffe rapidly, affecting morale that had already been weakened by constant retreat and material shortages. Tank crews who had maintained their fighting spirit despite overwhelming odds now faced a different reality. The Americans had eliminated their last advantage. German tactical doctrine had been built on the assumption of technical superiority, compensating for numerical inferiority. Defensive positions were chosen based on Tigers and Panthers being able to engage American armor at ranges where return fire was ineffective. Offensive operations assumed German heavy tanks could punch through American positions with acceptable losses. Both assumptions were now questionable. The psychological impact was reflected in increasing reports of mechanical breakdowns that resulted in tank abandonment. Crews who would previously have attempted field repairs under fire now declared vehicles irreparable at the first mechanical issue. Tank recovery vehicles reported finding abandoned German tanks with minor problems, loose tracks, empty fuel tanks, thrown treads, that crews would have routinely fixed weeks earlier. As American forces pushed toward the Rhine in late March 1945, German tank crews found themselves in an impossible position. They were ordered to hold bridgeheads against American advances, but they no longer knew what they were facing. Every engagement became a lethal gamble. Were those Shermans or Pershings approaching? The pattern repeated across the front. German tanks that had once stood their ground now withdrew at first contact. Defensive positions that should have held for days collapsed in hours. The material impact of 20 Pershings among thousands of American tanks was minimal, but the psychological impact was paralyzing. April 1945 saw the complete breakdown of German armoured resistance in the West. Units that still possessed operational tanks often refused to engage American armour without guarantee that no Pershings were present. Since no such guarantee was possible, many units essentially ceased offensive operations. The battle for Dessau on April 21st to 24th exemplified the new reality. German defenders, despite having operational Panthers and Tigers, adopted purely defensive positions and avoided engaging American armour at range. The American attack, which included Pershings among regular Shermans, met minimal organized resistance as German crews chose withdrawal over engagement with potentially superior American tanks. Tank aces who had accumulated dozens of kills abandoned their vehicles rather than face possible Pershings. The mere rumour of Pershings in a sector could cause German armoured units to withdraw. The Panzerwaffe that had conquered France and nearly defeated the Soviet Union had lost its will to fight. As German resistance collapsed in late April and early May 1945, thousands of German tank crew members became prisoners. Their interrogations, conducted by US Army intelligence officers, revealed the profound impact of discovering American heavy tank capability. Veterans consistently reported that learning about American heavy tanks represented a psychological breaking point. For 3 years, they had operated under the assumption of technical superiority. Even when outnumbered, even when retreating, they knew their Tigers were superior. When they learned Americans had equal or better tanks, the war became hopeless in their minds. The interrogations revealed that many German crews had never actually encountered a Pershing, but the fear of them had shaped every tactical decision. The uncertainty, not knowing whether approaching American tanks were Shermans or Pershings, proved as effective as actual combat in neutralizing German armor. What German tank crews didn't fully understand until after the war was the scale of American heavy tank production achieved by 1945. While only 310 Pershings reached Europe before Germany's surrender, with only about 20 seeing combat, American factories had produced over 2,200 M26 tanks total by October 1945. Fisher Body's Grand Blanc arsenal alone had produced 1,739 tanks, while Detroit Tank Arsenal, Chrysler, added 473 units. The assembly lines, once fully converted, could complete a Pershing in hours compared to the weeks required for German Tiger production. By comparison, Germany had produced only 1,347 Tiger I and 492 King Tiger tanks during the entire war. The production facilities told their own story. American tank production infrastructure dwarfed anything Germany had achieved. The ability to rapidly convert from Sherman to Pershing production while maintaining output demonstrated industrial flexibility Germany never possessed. German tank veterans who survived the war consistently identified learning about American heavy tanks as a pivotal psychological moment. These were not inexperienced crews who might panic unnecessarily, but hardened veterans with extensive combat experience who understood tank warfare intimately. Veterans described a before and after in their combat experience. Before learning about American heavy tanks, they maintained faith in ultimate German victory through superior technology. After, they fought only for survival, seeking ways to avoid combat rather than dominate it. The reaction of veteran crews differed markedly from their response to other Allied innovations. When faced with numerical superiority, they had adapted tactics. When faced with air supremacy, they learned to move at night and use concealment. But technological parity in tank design, the one advantage they had counted on since 1942, offered no tactical solution. Nothing symbolized the German psychological collapse more than the fate of King Tiger crews in the war's final weeks. The King Tiger represented the pinnacle of German tank design, 68 tons of armour and firepower that had been essentially invulnerable to frontal attack throughout its combat career. Yet by April 1945, King Tiger crews were increasingly reluctant to engage American armour. The King Tiger's 150mm frontal armour and long-barrelled 88mm gun should have maintained superiority over the Pershing. However, the psychological impact of knowing Americans possessed heavy tanks with powerful 90mm guns created paralysis. Crews that had once engaged confidently now hesitated, unsure whether they faced Shermans they could destroy or Pershings that could threaten them. Post-war analysis revealed how completely German intelligence had failed to detect the Pershing program. Despite extensive spy networks and signals intelligence, The Wehrmacht had no knowledge of American heavy tank development until Pershing started appearing in combat. The intelligence failure went deeper than missing the Pershing program. German intelligence had fundamentally misunderstood American industrial capability. They knew Americans produced many tanks, but assumed this meant accepting inferior quality. They couldn't conceive that American industry could pivot to producing heavy tanks while maintaining mass production advantages. April 1945 saw the complete breakdown of German armoured resistance in the West. Units that still possessed operational tanks often refused to engage American armour. The mere presence of American tanks in a sector could cause German withdrawals, regardless of actual American tank types present. Individual tank commanders reported increasingly desperate attempts to avoid engaging American armour. Tanks were declared mechanical losses after minor breakdowns that would have been field repaired weeks earlier. Crews reported enemy heavy tanks in sectors where reconnaissance later confirmed only Shermans operated. Ironically, the psychological impact of the Pershing far exceeded its actual combat performance. While superior to German tanks in many respects, the Pershing had its own problems. The transmission proved unreliable, leading to mechanical breakdowns. The gun, while powerful, had a slower rate of fire than German 88mm guns. The armour, though well sloped, was actually thinner than King Tiger armour. In purely technical terms, the Pershing was roughly equivalent to a Panther, superior in some aspects, inferior in others. It was not the super tank that German crews imagined. But the psychological impact didn't depend on technical reality. It depended on the shattering of German assumptions about American capabilities. Statistical analysis is problematic given that only about 20 Pershings saw actual combat. The limited sample size makes claims of specific kill ratios meaningless. What mattered was not statistical superiority, but psychological impact. German crews believed Americans had achieved tank parity or superiority, and this belief shaped their actions more than actual tank capabilities. The presence of Pershings accelerated German surrenders in the war's final weeks. Tank crews who might have continued fighting with Tigers and Panthers against Shermans chose surrender when facing possible Pershings. The psychological calculation was simple. Fighting Shermans with superior German tanks offered survival chances. Fighting potentially equal American tanks offered only death. The phenomenon repeated across the front. German tank crews, once among the most determined fighters in the Wehrmacht, became increasingly likely to surrender. US Army intelligence noted that by late April, German tank crew prisoners often arrived at collection points before infantry from the same units, a reversal of previous patterns where tank crews fought to the last. Remarkably, German tank units transferred from the Eastern Front, where they still faced Soviet tanks they could dominate, experienced severe psychological shock when learning about American heavy tanks. These units arrived confident in their technological superiority, only to discover that advantage might not exist against American forces. Schwerpanzerabteilung 503, transferred from the Eastern Front in March 1945, had destroyed hundreds of Soviet tanks, including the newest T-3485s and IS-2s. The crews considered themselves invincible. Within weeks of arriving in the West, the unit's effectiveness declined dramatically after reports of encounters with American heavy tanks. The contrast between Eastern and Western Front experiences created cognitive dissonance. Crews couldn't reconcile still dominating Soviet armour while potentially being matched by American tanks. The realization that Americans might have surpassed Soviet tank development while maintaining massive numerical superiority created a sense of facing an unstoppable force. As more German crews learned about Pershing capabilities through combat reports and intelligence briefings, technical details spread through the Panzerwaffe. Each new piece of information further affected morale. The stabilized gun system, the advanced transmission, the crew comfort features, all suggested American engineering had not just caught up, but potentially surpassed German design. The discovery that Pershing tanks included infantry telephones on the rear hull, allowing infantry to communicate directly with tank crews, demonstrated American attention to combined arms operations that German tanks lacked. The wet ammunition storage that prevented catastrophic explosions showed American concern for crew survival that German designs had ignored. Each technical detail reinforced a growing realization. Americans hadn't just matched German tank design, they had potentially improved upon it in ways German engineers hadn't considered. The psychological impact was significant for crews who had been told for years that German engineering was inherently superior. The final weeks of April 1945 saw the last engagements between German heavy tanks and American forces. These battles demonstrated the complete reversal of psychological dominance. Where Tiger crews had once stalked Shermans with confidence, they now fought with desperation and uncertainty. German doctrine called for engaging the most dangerous threat first, but identification uncertainty paralyzed decision-making. Crews hesitated, trying to identify whether approaching tanks were Shermans or Pershings, losing crucial first-shot opportunities. This hesitation often proved fatal, regardless of the actual American tank type. Post-war analysis by military historians revealed the significance of the Pershing's psychological impact on German armoured forces. While the limited number of Pershings in combat makes statistical analysis problematic, the effect on German morale is well documented. The numbers available support this analysis. In the 2 months before Pershing deployment, German tank units in the West maintained higher operational readiness despite material shortages. After Pershing appearance reports spread, readiness declined significantly, with many losses attributed to abandonment rather than combat damage. German tank crews had developed deep confidence in their technological superiority. This belief sustained morale through terrible losses and constant retreat. The Pershing's appearance shattered this belief system. Without it, German tank crews lost a crucial psychological foundation for continued resistance. In the decades after the war, German tank veterans consistently identified learning about American heavy tanks as the moment they knew the war was truly lost. At reunions and in memoirs, the theme repeated. Technological superiority had been their last hope, and the Pershing destroyed it. Veterans consistently described the psychological impact of discovering that American workers in Detroit had built tanks that could match German Tigers. The industrial democracy they had been taught to despise had achieved technical parity while maintaining overwhelming production advantages. This realization proved more demoralizing than military defeats. What German crews never fully learned during the war would have destroyed any remaining morale. The Pershing was just the beginning of American heavy tank development. The T-26E4 Super Pershing, with its enhanced 90mm gun, saw limited production of 25 units, with one reaching combat in Europe. The T-26E5, with increased armour up to 279mm thickness, existed in 27 prototypes. Beyond these, the T-29 heavy tank with a 105mm gun was in prototype phase. The T-30 with a 155mm gun existed in development. American tank design hadn't just caught up, it was accelerating past German capabilities while maintaining production advantages Germany never possessed. The production infrastructure told the real story. By April 1945, American tank production facilities covered over 50 million square feet of factory space. The Detroit tank arsenal alone exceeded much of German tank production infrastructure. Fisher Body had retooled entire automobile plants for tank production in months, a feat German industry never achieved. Beyond tactical and technical impacts, the Pershing created a moral crisis for German tank crews. They had been told they were fighting for German technological and racial superiority. The appearance of superior American tanks built by what Nazi propaganda called mongrel races challenged the ideological foundation of their fight. The cognitive dissonance was particularly severe for Waffen-SS tank crews, who were selected for ideological reliability. These men had accepted Nazi racial theory as justification for their actions. The Pershing's existence challenged the entire worldview that had sustained their fighting spirit. If Americans could build superior tanks, what did that say about racial superiority theories? The final accounting of Pershing impact reveals a complex story. In total, 310 Pershings reached Europe before Germany's surrender, but only about 20 saw actual combat. This limited deployment makes specific kill ratio claims statistically meaningless. What mattered was not how many German tanks Pershings destroyed, but how their mere existence affected German morale and tactical decision-making. German records show significant increases in tank abandonments in sectors where Pershings were rumoured to operate. Crew surrenders increased markedly after Pershing deployment became known. Operational readiness in panzer units dropped significantly, though multiple factors contributed to this decline. The greatest irony of the Pershing's impact was that German tank development had actually produced designs that might have exceeded American tanks, but too late and in too few numbers to matter. The Panther II, E-50 and E-75 programs represented advanced designs that might have maintained German technical superiority. But they existed only on paper or in prototypes when Pershings were entering production. This contrast embodied the fundamental difference between German and American approaches to warfare. Germans sought technical perfection in individual weapons. Americans sought sufficient quality in massive quantities. When Americans achieved technical parity with the Pershing while maintaining production superiority, German resistance became mathematically impossible. The psychological shock of discovering American heavy tank capability left lasting impacts on German military thinking. Post-war Bundeswehr doctrine emphasized that technological superiority alone could never again be assumed as a strategic advantage. The German military developed a healthy respect for American industrial capacity that persists to this day. Many German veterans who emigrated to America after the war cited the industrial might they witnessed, symbolized by the Pershing, as a factor in their decision. If America could produce such weapons while maintaining democratic freedoms and prosperity, perhaps the American system was worth embracing. Today, surviving Pershings stand in museums worldwide, silent testimony to American industrial achievement. At the Patton Museum at Fort Knox, a Pershing stands beside a captured King Tiger. The placard notes their rough technical equivalence, but doesn't capture the psychological revolution the American tank created. German veterans visiting these displays often reflected on the shock of discovering American heavy tank capability. The Pershing represented more than a weapon. It symbolized American industrial capacity finally focused on matching German quality while maintaining quantitative superiority. The full impact of the Pershing can be understood through verified numbers that tell the story of psychological warfare. German tank crew morale notably declined after reports of American heavy tanks spread. Only 20 Pershings saw combat, making specific kill ratios statistically meaningless. 310 Pershings reached Europe before VE Day. 2,202 total M26 tanks were produced by October 1945. German production: 1,347 Tiger and 492 King Tiger tanks during the entire war. Fisher Body alone produced 1,739 Pershings. Chrysler added 473. These numbers reveal that the Pershing's psychological impact far exceeded its limited combat deployment. The knowledge that Americans could mass-produce heavy tanks while Germany struggled to maintain existing vehicles proved as demoralizing as actual combat losses. The last verified German tank versus Pershing engagement occurred in late April 1945 as the war drew to its close. By then, the psychological damage was complete. German tankers who had entered the war supremely confident in their technological superiority ended it discovering that American industrial democracy had matched their best efforts. The story of German tankers discovering the Pershing's capability provides timeless lessons about warfare, psychology, and industrial capacity. It demonstrates that technological superiority alone cannot sustain military effectiveness without the industrial base to support it. More fundamentally, it shows how psychological factors can outweigh material ones in warfare. The Pershing's psychological impact far exceeded its actual combat presence. 20 tanks contributed to breaking the spirit of the once proud Panzerwaffe, not through overwhelming combat victories, but through shattering the myth of German technical superiority. The German tankers, who had entered the war supremely confident in their technological superiority, ended it discovering that American industrial democracy had matched and potentially exceeded their best efforts. The psychological journey from hunters to hunted, from superior to potentially inferior, occurred in just 8 weeks, from the first Pershing combat in late February to Germany's surrender in early May. The Pershing's true victory wasn't measured in destroyed German tanks. With only 20 in combat, statistical analysis is impossible, but in destroyed German certainty. Tank crews who had fought against overwhelming odds for years, sustained by faith in their technological edge, lost that faith when American heavy tanks appeared. In the end, the M26 Pershing accomplished what thousands of Shermans couldn't. It contributed to breaking the German tankers' spirit. Not through overwhelming numbers or superior tactics, but through the simple, devastating proof that American engineering had caught up. The long gun that German crews saw through their periscopes in those final battles wasn't just a weapon. It was the end of an era. German tankers never knew the American Pershing had a 90mm gun capable of killing their Tigers until those guns spoke in combat. When they did, the myth of German invincibility died. The hunters had become the hunted, and they knew it. In that knowledge lay the psychological collapse that helped end the war in Europe. The Pershing stands as testament to a fundamental truth of warfare. Technological superiority is temporary, but industrial capacity and democratic innovation endure. German tankers learned this lesson in the hardest possible way, staring down the barrel of an American 90mm gun that proved American democracy could produce weapons equal to anything German totalitarianism had created, even if in limited numbers that made their psychological impact far exceed their statistical significance.